But I do want to welcome Dr. Samuel Perry to be with us tonight, to be a part of this conversation. And Dr. Perry, I may allow you here in just a minute maybe to share a few things about yourself.
Sure.
Anyway, let's show our appreciation to these two guys and let the talking begin.
Hey.
Okay, so I became aware of Sam Perry through a book with Andrew Whitehead. I don't remember the title.
Taking America Back for God.
Take America Back for God. And I read it and I thought, there's so much good stuff in here. And I wrote you a letter, email, and he wrote me back. I thought, that's cool. And I was really impressed with that. Then I started following your work, and I read Philip Gorski,
Yep.
American Covenant. So I thought, that guy's really smart on American history and history in general. And then when your book came out, Crossing the Flag, or whatever it's called.
Flag and the Cross.
Flag and the Cross, sorry.
That's okay.
I used to remember titles. I can still remember old titles, but the newer ones don't last as long. But I just thought it was an exceptional book, and it mattered to me in working on Revelation because I think one of the biggest issues in the book of Revelation is Babylonian captivity of the church, is being captured by its desire to seize control. So I found so much help. I felt like I could have quoted you guys on every page, but I avoided. But I'd like you to tell us a little bit about your interests, what you do at the university.
Sure.
And your connections to us and what you're doing and working on.
Hey, what a privilege to be here. Thank you so much. And actually, I replied quickly to Scott when he reached out because I went to seminary about 15 years ago at Dallas Theological Seminary. And in that seminary, I was a New Testament major. And we read Scot McKnight's exegetical books there, and so Scott was a celebrity author to me, and so when he reached out, and I very much so knew who he was, and so I was, it was just great. Like let's talk about all of these things. I'll answer any questions. So I very much so appreciate Scott's work and everything he's contributed from his earlier exegetical work when he was fresh out of seminary as a professor, and then even later the things he has written, such as A Church Called Tove and the most recent stuff. I would say my entire career thus far, and coming out of undergraduate into what I'm doing now as a professor of sociology at the University of Oklahoma, as I've been fascinated with how American culture has entwined itself with American Christianity in a way that the two are often not indistinguishable from one another. They're difficult to disentangle in some really profound ways. In some ways that are just natural to culture. Like any culture that the church finds itself in, it's going to be a part of that. Like the language that is used and the terminology. And my in-laws are missionaries and they're Bible translators in Indonesia. And so they translate the Bible into those languages so that the people in those tribes can read the Bible in their own language. And now it's a part of their culture, right? In a way that is forever together, linked, right? They will read the words of God in their own language, and they will think through that in their own kind of words. So part of that is inevitable, but some of that we would say as Christians from a normative theological standpoint is really unfortunate. For example, our country's unfortunate history with racism and white supremacy. Our love affair with free markets and capitalism. And to be clear, I'm not Mr. kind of overthrow capitalism guy. That's not me as the sociologist, but I do acknowledge that there is this kind of weird obsession that evangelicalism has found itself connected to diehard free market, laissez-faire capitalism. Let's remove all regulations and those kinds of things, and safety nets are horrible, right? So I am fascinated by the way that American Christianity has found itself Americanized in some really profound ways. One of those ways is in politics. And so in the last few years, my co-authors and I have been gathering data on how Americans feel that America's fates and the church's fates are forever connected in some kind of a marriage. That the marriage is beneficial to both parties, that Christianity cannot be all that it could possibly be without our country doing its part, and that our country would be lost without the role of Christianity. And when I say Christianity, I mean a very specific kind of Christianity, and so I always want to put Christianity in quotes there, or put an asterisk by their name. When I say Christianity, I don't mean people who have asked Jesus to come into their heart or be their Lord and Savior. I mean Christianity as culture. And more specifically, Christianity is Anglo-Protestant ethno-culture, right? It means people like us. It means our way of doing things, our language, our values, our politics. And so all of our work on Christian nationalism has been trying to understand the consequences of this connection between the idea that Christianity is the real kind of Christianity, the right kind of Christianity is the kind that we have here in America, and the kind of America that I see is the one where my kind of Christianity is dominant. And I don't just mean dominant as in we've shared the gospel with everybody and they have become converted by giving their lives to Jesus. I mean, we have institutionalized our own form of Christianity so that we can exclude people from public office, so that we can enforce through legislation the kind of values that we feel like are the right kind of values, even if they are not the majority's values. So it is anti-majoritarian, it is anti-democratic, it is authoritarian in some really profound ways. And so that is what we've been doing. Now the connections, I think Scott and I may talk about it in a little bit. In some ways, it is profoundly connected to eschatology and the view of which way this world is going to progress in the future. And in some weird ways, it's actually disconnected. And so what we find, and we can springboard on this a little bit, is we often find that there has been a cart before the horse kind of thing. Like what these groups really care about, the authors that are writing these kinds of books, promoting it, and the people that are preaching about it, and the people that are really trying to agitate for it, what they care about is power. What they care about is influence. What they care about is control. And the eschatology that they have in mind isn't necessarily always like the best fitting eschatology for that. So I would say that there's actually been a movement within the movement to try to replace what has been their traditional eschatology, the dominant eschatology within evangelicalism, with an eschatology that makes a little bit more sense if what you want to do is justify your own power on this planet. And so we can unpack that a little bit more as we get going. But hopefully that's a little bit of background for you.
I think I followed all that.
Okay.
I'm just a humble New Testament guy. But I'm reading another book right now by Isaac Sharp called The Other Evangelicals. Yep. And Isaac Sharp is making a major point that evangelicalism and the churches of Christ would fit in these older categories. Not so much today, but at that time they would have been a part of that kind of movement, is that they were diverse in distinct ways. And I've read this chapter on race, I've read his chapter on liberalism, and I've read his chapter on politics, progressivism. And his contention is that in the really around Ronald Reagan, but from the time Carl Henry wrote his famous book, it's on the uneasy conscience of former fundamentalists, gave rise to what's called American neo-evangelicalism, and there became gatekeepers. And Carl Henry was one of them, and the Christianity Today was another one. And they had the power, because they had the platform, to be able to decide who really was an evangelical.
Right.
And so they pushed them off the platform. And then with race, it was slightly later than the 1950s and 1960s and the rise of Christianity Today. It became also connected to white supremacy, whiteness that was invisible to the white people who had the power. And they just simply excluded black evangelicals. I'm old enough to remember when Tom Skinner gave his famous lecture, talk, rant, prophetic address at the Urbana Conference, which was the biggest conference at the time. John Stott was always the leading speaker at it, and Tom Skinner gave an amazing address about the uncomfortability of African American evangelicals in the United States to be a part of the white evangelical institution. And the black evangelicals struggled with this. And then with progressive politics, he tells stories that I remember happening. Ron Sider writing his book, Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger. Jim Wallace always getting under the skin of somebody. And the politics were classic evangelical concern with justice. I mean, what can be wrong with justice for Christians who believe in the Bible? And concern that economics can sometimes get out of hand. Capitalism can overflow its boundaries. And what the big point was that the gatekeepers had the power to be able to tell people who was an evangelical and who was not. And it didn't matter what they believed. My African American students can believe everything that Christianity today believes theologically, and they will never say they're evangelicals, right, because they don't fit in the culture, and that's exactly what you were getting at. Right. And in the politics, where I think Sam has so much to tell us, and I'm quite interested in this because I saw it in his book with Andrew Whitehead and then in with Phil Gorski, is the rise of white Christian nationalism should be a deep concern to all Christians because it embodies and symbolizes this entire wedding of American culture with Christianity. And I'm more of an I study older texts than anything happening today. I have to rely on experts like Sam and Ryan Burge.
Sure, Ryan Burge.
And then, but I've studied Constantinianism in the 4th century, where when the church combined with political power, the church is what lost. So I'm interested in you defining what Christian nationalism is, and I'm particularly concerned with how it's connected to eschatology, and he had 2 amazing tweets today. He has great tweets, but Chris told me about it. I didn't see it. I'm not very good on Twitter. But she said, you got to read this by Sam Perry. He said, you know who he is? And I said, yeah, he's going to be with us tonight. So sure. Tell us a little bit about the eschatology and white nationalism, but white nationalism first.
Right, sure. So let's I think defining this is important because I can no longer say, when we started to talk about Christian nationalism a few years ago, we felt like we were in kind of an uphill climb, like as right after Trump was elected, and every headline the day after, and I can show you, we collected all of these headlines. Every one of them said 4 out of 5 white evangelicals voted for Trump. White evangelical, like it was just the repeated mantra. Every headline was about how could 4 out of 5 white evangelicals vote for Trump. When we started to dig into the data, we found it actually wasn't about being a white evangelical. We were trying to change that narrative. What we found is it was this underlying ideology, this belief that America rightfully belongs to Christians like us, and Trump promised that. I mean, if you look at his rhetoric and his speeches, he would talk about how nobody's saying Merry Christmas anymore, and Christianity will have power, and I will defend our Christian heritage, and I will bring Christianity back, and we will rally around Christianity. It's the kind of Christian nationalist language that we see as all too familiar now. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to change the narrative and say it's not about being an evangelical, white conservative Christian or an evangelical. It's about what they believe about what Trump represents and what he's going to deliver for them, Christian nationalism. I can no longer say people are not talking about Christian nationalism enough. It has become such a common thing, in fact, that the concept itself is in danger of becoming diluted in some really unfortunate ways. And in fact, it's become such a popular thing that publishers are now changing book titles to superfluously include Christian nationalism in the title. I know of several authors who have had their book titles changed by the publisher, who have said, I know your book isn't about Christian nationalism, but if we want to sell this book, we're going to call it Christian nationalism. And so that it has become such a hot thing that you just like my dad used to work for Procter & Gamble, and he said they manufacture like Tide and all these kinds of things. And he said there was a time when every product we had, they just slapped Febreze on it, like the label Febreze, because like if Febreze was so popular, like if you wanted to sell it, you had to just put now with Febreze. And it seems like that's almost become the thing for books, right? If you want to sell that book, you got to slap Christian nationalism on that. So what's going on, though, is we have to be very careful. When that happens, we want to be very careful because we don't want Christian nationalism to become this kind of slur that the left uses to say any Christian who believes something that I believe, or anybody who's right of me politically, is now a Christian nationalist. That's neither fair nor helpful to say. So we want to be very clear about that. So we can define Christian nationalism as three things, and because it can serve in three different ways. Christian nationalism, in the one hand, can be an ideology. It can be something that, by ideology, I mean it is a set of values and beliefs that people hold. Specifically, it's an ideology that idealizes and advocates a fusion of American civic life with a very particular kind of Christianity. And when I say a particular kind of Christianity, again, I don't mean the kind that means like you ask Jesus into your heart to be your Lord and Savior. I mean white Protestant Anglo culture, right, or ethno culture. It can also be an identity. It is becoming more and more the case that people are self-identifying as Christian nationalists as the term has taken on popularity. If you look, Ryan Burge shared data with me about how many times Christian nationalism has been used on Twitter in all of the year 2022. And if you look at the numbers, it goes level. Even when my book was published, sadly, in April, it was basically the same kind of frequency. And then all of a sudden in June and July, it takes off. It just catapults into the air and bounces. That wasn't because of me, unfortunately. It was because of Marjorie Taylor Greene, who records a video of herself and posts it online saying the Republican Party ought to be the party of Christian nationalism. She went on speeches and she recorded herself several times saying it. She sold T-shirts that said "Proud Christian Nationalists" and had pictures of herself with her dukes up saying, like, "I'm a proud Christian nationalist." And it stayed high like that. So within the last 6 months, 2 books have been written arguing for Christian nationalism by name, why we should all be Christian nationalists, why that's a good thing. So it is an ideology, it is an identity that people are increasingly embracing, but it is also, and I think most importantly, it has become a political strategy that politicians who neither embrace the ideology or the label can use to try to mobilize those audiences. And this is what I feel like Trump has represented within the last 8 years. I don't think Trump is a Christian nationalist. I don't think he believes any of those kinds of things. I don't think he believes much of anything. I think he believes in himself. I think he believes in winning. I think he believes in winners and losers. I think he believes in those kinds of things. But I don't think he's a Christian nationalist in the sense that I'm talking. But he does seem to know this is what works. On the campaign trail, I use this rhetoric, I use this kind of language, and people seem to get excited and people seem to rally around me. And I just got data back today that we'll talk about in a second. I just got data back today, national survey data that I collected with my co-author, Josh Grubbs. I was so excited to get it. It was perfect timing. Of course, I dive right into the data. My kids want to play soccer, and I'm like, oh, sorry, guys, data. And so this is my life. So I'm crunching the numbers, and it's not even close. Like the vast majority of Americans who subscribe to Christian nationalism, this survey was done just within a couple of weeks ago. So with all the legal trouble Trump is going through, the vast majority of Americans, white Americans who subscribe to Christian nationalist ideology, will vote for him again. DeSantis wasn't even close. DeSantis actually went down as Christian nationalism went up, like in terms of popularity. They like Trump, they want Trump, they will rally around him because he makes those kinds of promises to them. So here's where the eschatology comes in, and this is where it's interesting. So we got this data back. So we asked I was thinking, hey, this has now become a national conversation about what these people believe theologically and how it potentially motivates the movement. And so we asked questions, knowing something. I went to Dallas Theological Seminary, a place that knows something about eschatology and has done a lot of historical I think writing in that area and has put out, I think for better or for worse, a lot of books kind of arguing for these positions. The vast majority of evangelical Christians, conservative Christian Americans, are what we would call premillennial, pre-trib kind of Christians, meaning that they believe Jesus' millennial reign is off in the future, that it hasn't happened yet, that it will be a literal 1,000-year reign, and for that to happen, The world's got to go to hell in a handbasket. It's going to get worse and worse. And eventually it'll get so bad that Jesus will return. He will rapture up his people for this like 7-year tribulation period. And then he will come back and he will reign for 1,000 years. The kind of competition there to that is what we'd call postmillennialism, meaning Jesus' millennial reign has already begun, and the world is Christ's. And so what Christians have to do is they have to overcome the world. They have to rule the institutions. They have to be in charge of the institutions. They have to try to gain control of those things so that they can bring about Christ's millennial reign here, now, on earth. And what we found is this really fascinating contradiction. You would think white Christian nationalists would be all post-mill, right? And historically, folks like John Rouseus Rushdoony, or Rouseus John Rushdoony, was post-mill. Francis Schaeffer was a post-mill. These were people who really did think Christians ought to bring about the kingdom here and now. But we find the vast majority of evangelicals, not evangelicals, vast majority of people who subscribe to Christian nationalism, even the ones who say Christians ought to take control of the government. We ought to be able to institute our own rule here. Most of them subscribe to premillennial tribulation, kind of like, they're not post-mills. They're not. So what that means is they're actually buying into an eschatology that is ill-fitting for like their agenda. And so and that is kind of a historical consequence. What it means is like these people have a theology that is dominant, but they want power. And so the power play dominates the theology, right? Like their theology would suggest go after this thing, but their desire for power says, no, we really want this right now. And so what you're actually finding within the movement is you're finding people who are writing these books for Christian nationalism are trying to change that. They're trying to say, no, this theology doesn't work. That premillennialism is the theology of losers. That is, and this is what writers like Andrew Torba, who's the anti-Semitic founder of Gab, who wrote a book for advocating for Christian nationalism. He basically said, he has a whole chapter where he says premillennialism is the theology of losers. We need a theology of victory, and that is post-mill. That is this theology that says the world is Christ, we will take it back, and it is ours right now if we're willing to do that. And I'm kind of curious to see how this movement will unfold in the next few years as this kind of idea gains steam.
It's fascinating. And these were the two tweets, and you fleshed it out. Yeah. But you would think that people who are, and I think everybody understands premillennialism. They believe in a millennium, that Jesus will come back before the millennium. Pre-trib is that there's a rapture before a 7-year tribulation. That's a pretty standard conservative evangelical eschatology. Right. You would think that they would become passive in the political process, and many of them did. Although that narrative of the lack of fundamentalists involved in political process is being revised slightly now. But there is very clearly, you would think that they would become passive instruments of just go evangelize people and forget the political process. Right. But something happened under Reagan to evangelicals that stirred them to become more active in the political process. Right. And they mirrored, in some ways, people like the progressives, like Jim Wallace and Ron Sider. But this idea, I was not aware. Trudeau, what'd you call him? What's this guy's name?
Torba.
Torba,
Andrew Torba.
I don't know him. That he's actually attacking pre-trib stuff, pre-Millel stuff, as for losers.
Yeah, the eschatology of losers.
Is that what he calls it?
Yeah.
That is amazing. And William Wolfe, the same?
Not William Wolfe, Stephen Wolfe.
Stephen Wolfe?
Yeah, William Wolfe is a troll. Stephen Wolfe is an author of a works with Doug Wilson. He's the author of The Case for Christian Nationalism.
Is he a post-mill type guy yet?
I think he's difficult to pin down. I think he tries to resist those kinds of labels, as far as I understand, but I think the argument fits.
This is a fascinating thing to watch, because this is how pre-mill arose in America. It arose in the wake of a political process. American premillennialism is not European premillennialism. It is tied to the American agendas. It was tied to sectional reconciliation with D.L. Moody. Yeah. It was tied to conversion to make a big difference. And it was a sort of a threat that people have to change. So I'm fascinated by this, and I don't know what to say other than I want to know more about this.
Sure. Well, so I think something we have to understand right now, and this is most of my work now is in politics and basically functioning as a political scientist these days. And with no disrespect to political scientists, I think oftentimes political scientists are very concerned with partisanship and parties, and oftentimes they would acknowledge, they kind of ignore the religious aspect of that and why it is important. But I think something that political scientists have gotten right within the last few decades is understanding how our religious identities and beliefs are becoming increasingly subordinated under partisan and ideological identities. And that is when you hear the language of polarization, it's almost become a cliche, like America is so polarized, we're so polarized. That probably doesn't mean what you think it means. So when we say Americans are polarized, it doesn't mean that Americans are rapidly moving towards extremes on every issue. That actually is not the case. If I was to show you a distribution of where people fall on most issues. Most people are moderates. Like most people are moderates. They're not extreme conservative, extreme liberal. The tails of that distribution are not getting fatter. Most people are still in the middle, right? So what is happening, though, is that people are sorting themselves. And they're sorting themselves. The primary headings under which they are sorting themselves is ideological identity, liberal and conservative, and partisan identity, Republican and Democrat. And since over the past few decades, one of the things that really started to coalesce under Reagan and has since become completely solidified. I mean, I don't know if you guys would I mean, it surprises my students when I say this, that around 1980, and certainly in the 1970s, you were just as likely to be a white evangelical Democrat as a Republican.
That's right.
Right, like that wasn't, but now that's just laughable. Of course, like white evangelicals make up 40% of the Republican Party, and white Christians make up 80%, and we are increasingly sorting in that way. So what that means is people are finding where they fit. Who are my people? Who are the people that I represent? And what's dictating that is what party do you belong to, and are you liberal or conservative? And so what that does, though, is it often takes people of faith who believe certain things, and it forces us to adjust our own theologies to basically fit the party need or the ideological need. So if I am a character conservative, right? Like I'm somebody who values character and leadership, and I would like to say that. I would like to think that, like, I want my leaders to have character. I want them to be honest and to be people of integrity, and to be the kind of people that I would want my kids to grow up being. And I like the way they talk, and I like the way they present themselves because that's Christ-like. And yet, I find my political needs at the moment, we really need that W come November, right? Like we really need to, because the alternative is they win and they're horrible and we know they're the devil themselves. So what we need to do is we need to adjust our theology to make sure that, we win. And what that means is our politics has now shaped our theology effectively. And that is what we are finding increasingly in survey after survey after survey for the last few decades. We find that young people, especially, I see a lot of young people in the audience, one of the leading contributors that young people are now abandoning Christianity, right? Like they're chucking their faith. Is because they find the identity of who they feel like Christians ought to be and what they feel like Christians are expected to be politically, to be so at odds that they say, well, I'm nothing. I don't want any part of that. And so we find this in experimental data, we find this in survey data, that young people who tend to embrace more progressive values on certain things, as young people often do, they find that, okay, Christian means I must be a right-wing conservative. I must be a right-wing Republican, staunch Republican. Well, then I will want no part of that, right? Like I don't want any part of it. And so I think the wedding of those things has been, as you were saying, I think really it's in a Constantinian kind of way. It has not been something that has shaped Christianity for the good. It is actually something that is emptying Christianity of its youth. And its alternative voices to be able to advance as a subculture, as a movement, as somebody that as a force for the redemption of a nation in a good way, right? Like not in a top-down power way, but in a way that is kind of the salt and light of the earth that we'd like it to be.
I remember reading Ryan Burge's book, in which he argued that the reason people voted for a political party was not because of their Christian faith, Christians voting, but that their political party had reshaped their Christian faith.
Right.
So that's
I think so.
this is a frightening thing. And I think, for me as a New Testament professor, getting nearer to the end of my career than the beginning of a career, it deeply concerns me that we have not developed a theopolitical hermeneutic to be able to discern the impact of politics, of, let's say, ideologies upon our Christian faith. And I believe that this is one of the reasons I wrote the book on Revelation, is because I thought this offers a pretty stiff critique of Babylon, of political power, and says these are the marks of what Babylon looks like, and we need to challenge this and become dissidents. And that does not mean that we can't be engaged in political issues. I mean, I think we can. But I think Christians have the opportunity to speak into political issues at a moral, insightful level of justice that other people don't have the same capacity or the same passion for. And I think we've lost some of that. And your comment about young people losing their faith is in part because they don't see the distinction between a political process, a political ideology, and what people are talking about in churches.
Right.
I heard this, I remember one time reading a book, and I thought it was Randy Ballmer, and I talked to Randy Ballmer about this. He says, I don't know, I never heard that, but I sure hope I did say it sometime, is that mainline churches began to lose their people because they could not tell the difference on Sunday from the sermons in church and the New York Times the other 6 days of the week. Well, I think this has happened in spades with evangelicalism, white evangelicalism in the United States, is that people are saying, I don't want to be a part of that. If Christianity only means Republican, then I want to jump ship. So.
Yeah, I think when those two become indistinguishable, when Christianity just becomes kind of a moral arm or an obvious recruiting tool for a partisan kind of play or agenda, I mean, I think people recognize that immediately and say, this isn't for me. This is inconsistent with what I feel and what I see.
Sam gave some strong words about Donald Trump. I think we need to be able to do that. I live in a world, I teach in a school that doesn't care about Donald Trump. My students are mostly progressive. But I know a lot of people who think that if we are criticizing Donald Trump, that we are socialists. And this is a fundamental mistake. And I think that people who can't see, I totally agree with you. I've said this to my wife 150 times since 2014, is that I don't think the guy believes anything, but he knows what works when he stands on that platform and gets people clapping, and he's able to draw on that. And I want to be able to say that without saying what my politics are. I want to be able to judge a person theopolitically and make discernment. And I think we have lost the capacity to do this because of sorting that you were just talking about. Is that I can't tell you the number of times I've had people say to me, well, you must be a social democrat. And I thought, well, I don't think I am. I haven't thought about that. I certainly haven't signed on a line about this. And I've had other people say to me, you must be a Republican because I made a negative remark about Barack Obama or I made a negative remark about Donald Trump. I must be on the other team.
Right.
Team Lamb versus Team Dragon and Babylon. So.
And it is actually, it's something that shapes, and this is how we know that those kinds of identities, those political and ideological identities, are now shaping everything we have. It now shapes even the things that we consume. Whether you drive a pickup or a Prius tells me something about like how you vote. And even this past couple of weeks, what kind of beer you drink, right? Like, so there's commercials now that are advertising for like, conservative dad's beer or like, or
is it really?
Which beer is the woke beer? I don't want that beer. I want the, and so now if it actually signifies the kind of my consumption pattern. It's become a signal of which team that I'm on, and here's how pernicious this is. It completely reorients our understanding of reality. So like our identities and the identities that we hold most important. Let me give you something that we found in the data this week. Now is this camera going on? Is this going on live? Okay, so this is something that we're going to write about. But we asked Americans. I'm curious how people position themselves with different groups and people in history, right? Because my hunch is that anybody who we think is a good guy has to be on my political team, and anybody that I think is a bad guy has to be on their political team, no matter where they actually were on the political spectrum. So let's agree for a second. Stalin, probably, totalitarian, but very leftist in the sense that he was like trying to institute the communist government. Hitler, very right on the spectrum, very far extreme right, a fascist, a Nazi, right? So like you've got Stalin, very far leftist, Hitler, very far on the right. Well, I asked Americans in this survey, where would you place all these people? From Jesus, Martin Luther King Jr., Abe Lincoln, Stalin, Hitler, Lenin, Nazis, fascists, commies, all those kinds of things. And I asked them, where would you put them on this ideological spectrum? From one equals like very far left, extremely left, left wing to right, and what I found is all of our heroes. So Jesus, if you were a Republican, Jesus was far right. If you were a Democrat, Jesus was far left. Same with Martin Luther King Jr., same with Abraham Lincoln. So like you wanted to own those guys. But the fascinating thing was that if you were a Republican, Hitler was a leftist. And if you were a Republican, Nazis and fascists are leftists apparently. But if you're a Democrat, Stalin, Lenin, and commies are rightists, or like are right wing, right? So this kind of these partisan identities completely reorient our understanding of history, where people actually are, and it goes along with this sorting idea. Our desire to divide the world into good guys and bad guys, our team versus their team, is so powerful that it completely shapes our interpretation of where we position ourselves and everybody else in history. And if you ever wondered, why is it that Jesus looks like a Democrat to Democrats, and why does Jesus look like a Republican to Republicans? We have empirical confirmation that is in fact the truth. That you want to own the people that you feel like are good, and you want to say you cannot say these bad guys were too conservative if I'm a conservative, right? You can't say these bad guys were too liberal if I'm a liberal. And so it's kind of fascinating. It is dictating everything about the way we orient ourselves in social life now.
This is fascinating.
Data,
okay.
It's fun.
All right. Now, when I was teaching university students, undergrad students, I became aware of a test in Wales that was given in all public schools.
Right.
It was a basic psychology test of 24 questions. And the questions were about Jesus.
Okay.
So, well, they started with questions about people's own identity. So they asked people 24 basic psychology questions. Are you a nervous type person? I don't remember what the questions were. It didn't matter. Then they distracted the students. They were high school students and easily distractible. They asked them their demographics. How old are you? Where did you grow up? Where are your parents from? How many parents in your home, etc. Then they asked the same questions that they had asked themselves of Jesus. So if they said, are you nervous? They asked, was Jesus a nervous
Fascinating.
person?
Wow.
The results of it was everybody thought Jesus was like them.
Was like them.
And now this is wonderful if you're a discipleship guru, and you think you're making people to look like Jesus. But the result of this was, it's not that people were getting close to Jesus, it's that they were capturing Jesus by their own personality.
Right.
So that's
absolutely.
The Democrats have always thought Jesus was a Democrat, and the Republicans have always thought Jesus was a Republican. And the communists think Jesus is on their side too.
Right.
Just read Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto.
Right.
There's stuff out of Acts chapter 2 from it.
Right.
So that, this is really fascinating to me. So,
and it's actually one of the fundamental, if you ever take my sociology of religion class, it's one of the fundamental insights of like early sociologists of religion. Emil Durkheim wrote this book, Elementary Forms of Religious Life, and this is around the turn of the century, 1900s. And one of his kind of principal arguments is that we have a tendency, human beings have a tendency to look up at God and project our own. Yeah. And he's not the first person to observe that. Spinoza observed that. Feuerbach observed that. Philosophers have observed that before. That we have a tendency to project our own biases and beliefs onto the divine, which is something that we always have to be like as Christians. We always want to be aware of that temptation and that tendency to just use Jesus as my own little sock puppet to parrot my own biases rather than speaking to me and sitting underneath and feeling rebuked and feeling corrected and feeling, you know what, I didn't think that. I've been wrong, right? But if your Jesus says exactly what you want him to say all the time, turns out you're never wrong. That's great, right? Like, it's just what a neat coincidence.
Anne Lamott said it best, I think, something like, when all your enemies are God's enemies, then you got a problem.
That's right.
Well, I know a lot of you would like to ask Sam Perry questions. And because of his sociological work and his stuff. So I want to make sure there's time for some questions from the audience. Is it your
Of course, yeah, absolutely.
You're pretty good at this. I'm pretty sure you've heard these questions a lot. So if there's some questions, please speak up. Yes.
So Jesus was a Cardinal fan. Hitler was a Cub fan.
Well, that's a little strong, but I know God is for the Guardians.
That's right.
So you guys have talked about you brought up this concept of a theopolitical hermeneutic, and I kind of latched on to that phrase as something that I thought was potentially really valuable as something for us to aim at. So if I could ask a really broad question, if you were to give some, some basic pointers as to what is the, and I feel like I may know the answers to some of this already, but if you were to say, hey, these are some of the surest ways that we can start to construct a proper theopolitical hermeneutic for ourselves, what would be, say study practices or life practices or mental frameworks that we could put ourselves into that would lend us and, lead us towards that direction?
What a great question. I mean, you talked about you brought up the word.
Yeah,
sure. You should define.
Okay, all right.
Could one of you repeat that question?
Yeah.
We can't hear it back here.
Sure. Walls is his last name, right? Is asking a question about sort of what are the practices or ideas connected to a theopolitical hermeneutic. I think as an American citizen, I have to operate in two sectors of life. For instance, as a Christian, this is how I live. And in a public sector, I can't assume that everybody's going to agree with my view of Jesus.
Right.
So, theopolitically, I want to begin with the fact that God has revealed himself fully in Jesus Christ. So this becomes for me a revelation of the way, the truth, and the life. So I would begin with that, and then I think from that I'm going to let Jesus' way of life, the scriptures, inform me on how, as a Christian, I need to live and judge, let's say, politics. So I want to be able to have the capacity as a Christian who believes in Jesus. I think most Christians should believe in Jesus. Who believes in the way of Jesus, that I want to have the capacity to discern injustices, unloving practices and habits, laws that don't work for all people, and when our system becomes systemically injustice, and I want to be able to discern that as a theopolitical hermeneutic. And I think Deuteronomy, in some ways, Isaiah, Joel, Amos, Jesus, Revelation, they give us, I think, some of the best categories for us to be able to discern that theopolitically. So for me, I would want to focus on justice and love and peace as the ultimate forms of how a Christian would want laws in our country and all the people to behave. And I think this is where I'm Anabaptist, and that is, I believe the Christian's calling is to embody this in a church first, and out of their church experience of striving for peace, justice, and love, to be able to move that into the public sector in a way that has integrity because of the church experience of where that works. And right now, the church is not doing well in the United States with its embodiment of any three of those things.
Yeah, spot on. I mean, I would only add, I think, and this is just pointing back to your own work, I think that theopolitical hermeneutic should be applied to how we interpret Scripture, not as I think our temptation to, and this is what I learned in seminary, and I think this is an unfortunate thing I learned in seminary. Probably part of it due to the proliferation of, I think, systematic theologies like Grudem's or others that have argued that theology is kind of like putting together a jigsaw puzzle where you've got to, like a good biblicist, kind of take every little text and kind of see how you can cram it into this kind of coherent narrative, rather than interpreting the Bible theologically, which is what we're talking about, like in the hermeneutic key being the person of Christ and what Christ taught, like to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself, and allowing those things to interpret the Bible with you and interpret our politics in a way that I don't do that because it is inconsistent with what Jesus taught about loving my neighbor more than myself, right? Like that is inconsistent. Like loving my neighbor means not oppressing them. It means not taking away rights that I enjoy that they can't have now, and those kinds of things. And how can I serve them? And so I think Scott said it beautifully.
Let me give you an example. Economics. I think a Christian should have a different perspective on economics than, let's say, a bold and bald capitalism, which is amoral, I think. I don't think it's immoral. I think there's an amorality to systems of economics. Mm-hmm. If the right people do the right things, everything can be held in check. But I am really impressed by something the Apostle Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. And these verses won't let me go. Paul says to the Corinthians, he sort of badgers them, manipulates them, guilts them, does whatever he can to get them to give money for the poor saints in Jerusalem. And then he says this. He said, this is not to take money from you, but it is to achieve isotes, is the Greek word. You know what this means. Equality. This word is a very interesting word because equality pretty much means equality. It's not hard to define. But when the NIV defines it, in Colossians, with slavery, they translate it as fair. Now, you talk about a non-translation. What the heck does fair mean? Really, if I was with the Lutherans, I'd say other words. But Paul wants the Corinthians, who have a lot, to give to the Jerusalem poor so that there can be equality. And someday, when the Jerusalemites have more than the Corinthians, they can give it back, and it's equality. And you know what passage he appeals to? The manna miracle of Exodus 14, where what did people have? Everything they needed for that day and no more. That's Paul's paradigm economically for Christians in treating other Christians who have financial difficulties. This verse right here, I have said these things in public in places where people have accused me of quoting someone who is a socialist. No kidding. Because that's what it sounds like, doesn't it? Well, I believe that's a Christian mentality toward economics that we should embody in sharing with those who don't have, rather than supporting mega churches. I was in a mega church one time when in one weekend they raised some $60 million. That's a lot of money, a lot of wealthy people. To build a new stage that was first class with huge screens, and the initials of that church are Willow Creek. But they have a lot of money. They had a lot of money, and they could spend it on themselves, but they also did a pretty good job with the poor. I believe this is the Christian approach to economics. And I want to favor policies in our government that move in that direction, in responsible and accountable ways. Okay, sorry.
Well, beautifully said. Yeah.
This is a dissident question, I guess. So,
We want these questions for Sam Perry.
well, I'll tie it in. He talked on taking on Christian nationalism as a title, as an identity.
Yep.
As a dissident, what is our response to be to people who want that marriage, who want that proud, dig your heels in to say this is the right way, God's way is America's way, because that's our life, that is our character, our history. As a dissident in living in amongst Bible America, where that is the standard, more so, what is the mindset that we should take to having conversations to that degree?
Well, it depends who it is, doesn't it? And it depends on your relationship to that person to be able to speak into their life in a way that they're actually going to listen to you. And there's a lot of times when we try to coerce that conversation by forcing ourselves into their lives, and they just aren't going to listen. We've all encountered people that we know pretend that they're listening, and they actually aren't capable of receiving what we have to say. So I would say we have to begin with that. And then I think it's best to ask questions of people, to probe things together, to say, what does it mean for us to live as Christians in the United States with the election when we want to be serious followers of Jesus? How can that reframe the way we vote? And what does it mean to be a Christian who pursues justice? Which candidate is going to pursue justice in the most effective Christian way? Which candidate is going to pursue an economic policy that we would favor? Which candidate is going to pursue attitudes toward war and toward peace in the world? And that's what I would try to do it with some questions. But you, Hunter, you know as well as I do that this is a very difficult conversation in America right now because of sorting. And it's something that we need to learn to negotiate better so that we can help one another think more clearly in Christian ways.
Yeah, I think I love that Scott started with the idea that every conversation needs to be approached with discernment and really a kind of a realistic understanding of who am I talking to and if this is going to be a productive conversation. I don't tend to have these kinds of conversations on Twitter, for example, because that's just kind of a waste of everybody's time and you know, not particularly productive. People are not coming to that with a posture of like, let's work things out together. But if this is kind of I like the idea of asking questions as well. And I have found that like, once you kind of dig in a little bit and kind of ask really pressing questions about like, what does that mean for the outsider? What does that mean for people who don't believe what you believe? Because the reality of the situation is that like Christianity in this country is not on the ascent, right? Like it's among younger generations in particular, right? Like that, and for the reasons that we're talking about. So it increasingly looks like any kind of Christian control or any kind of like institutionalized Christian identity or enforcement of that will inevitably be minoritarian, right? Like it'll be an autocracy. It'll be what we call a Herrenvolk autocracy or a Herrenvolk democracy, like the perception of like votes happening and things like that. But like restrictions have been put in place to where certain people don't count and their votes don't count, and it makes it real difficult. So I want to hear them articulate that. I want to hear them say out loud, yes, we're the only ones who should be allowed to rule, right? Like we're the only ones. And if I can get them to say that in public, I'd like that too, right? Because I would prefer them to have to fess to that idea, to cop to that idea that yes, at the end of the day, only we should be allowed to hold public office. Only we should be allowed to, yes, I would exclude those people. Yes, I would arrest those people. Yes, I would pass blasphemy laws or Sabbath laws or those kinds of things to make sure I punish with fines or potentially violence if those people violate the kinds of things. And I feel like once they articulate that move or that position, which I think is the inevitable consequence of where they're going, I feel like then it has been revealed for what it is, which is anti-democratic, authoritarian, us versus them kind of posturing. So these aren't gotcha kind of things. I'm not trying to yell at them, and I'm not trying to shout anybody down, which is why I try to pick my battles. But I think with strategic questions, you can kind of get to like, where does this lead? In some ways that like, talk to me about the policies. Talk to me about what you would actually institute and put in place. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, yeah.
I once heard Walter Brueggemann talk about how the Old Testament is primarily about, or more primarily about neighborliness in the economy than atonement. Would you guys agree with that? And if so, like, how would that change the Christian conversation on politics?
Wow.
You went to seminary.
That sounds good. I mean, like, I am not to adjust the conversation, but I kind of, in piggybacking on what you said earlier, I think one of my hermeneutics, other than the life of Christ, and I'm trying to think about like, how do I live in this world, is the constant is how do I keep at the forefront the understanding that I am a sojourner and an alien in this world, and that this is not my home. And that I am called to redeem and be a participant in the redemption of this world in various ways, through my love of my neighbor and if necessary, self-sacrifice. What does that look like? To be Christ to people like Paul in Philippians 3, where he wants to be. The identity as a disciple of Christ was in the early church, one of suffering, one of like uniting, like being a part of that suffering and that self-sacrifice on behalf of people who don't know Jesus. So what does it mean to live like an alien, to live like a sojourner, to know that my future is secure and I don't have to fight and scrap for power anymore, like, because that's no longer something that I need to make my life meaningful. And so I like the idea of neighborliness being kind of among these kind of key hermeneutics that should guide our politics. Now, I think the unfortunate thing is when you talk to folks who really have bought into this ideology, it's scary how quickly they can move to, well, sometimes the most loving thing is to just take power out of somebody else's hand and tell them what to do, right? Like they would jump to some kind of analogy of like, well, if somebody is mentally ill or if somebody is my child or something like that, the most loving thing is to spank them or lock them up or do those kinds of things. In which case that reasoning can justify anything, right? Like the most loving thing I can do right now is kill you, right? Like, or the most loving thing I can do is keep you from making any decision that I think would be immoral and that would heap more judgment on you. That is the loving thing, to control these and marginalize these populations. And so that has to be kind of the fulfillment of that. What does it look like to be a neighbor and to really love and to really live out the second commandment is where the rubber meets the road. What do you have?
Well, Brueggemann is always worth reading. And every time you read him, he'll make you mad and he'll teach you something important. But Brueggemann is saying something that's very interesting, is about neighborliness versus atonement. Now that's a fascinating polarization or something that he's doing, because he's probably pushing against the typical evangelical type question about people getting saved. I always ask my Old Testament colleagues, the first question I ask them in theological conversations is, can you tell me someone in the Old Testament who got saved? Just start thinking. And you think, well, Abraham, he believed and he was justified by faith. Okay, now other than Abraham, anyone else? It's just not a question that's being asked. That's what he's pushing against, about the atoning death. Furthermore, the sacrificial system in the Old Testament was not that kind of saving system. That's not how it worked. You went to Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, every year. So it wasn't like your first communion or something like that, or first Passover. You were nurtured into the faith by your family. And that's how Jews became faithful and covenant people. The New Testament shifts that emphasis to more of a voluntary thing, is that as the gospel moves into the Gentile world, you now have people who weren't reared and nurtured in Judaism that now have to make a decision about this Jesus. But constantly in the pages of the New Testament, the ethic is an ethic in relationship with other people. Look at the fruit of the Spirit. How many of those are for you and God alone? 0. They're all about our relationship to others. And the fruit of the Spirit, these are Paul's big categories of what happens to people who are living in Christ. They have the Spirit. They now are people who are neighborly with other people in their relationships. So the ethic of the New Testament is an ethic of relating to others in the world, whether they're believers or followers of Jesus or not. Right. So Brueggemann kills it all the time. He's always worth reading.
So I'm a youth minister, and I was thinking about the example you gave of the student. You know, their theology, their political beliefs start bringing them away from their theological beliefs. And I was thinking about, I've also seen the other side of things where their lifestyle gets away from being a Christian, but because of their political beliefs, they'll still hang on to that title of Christian.
Interesting.
So how do you see that based on your background on the other side of things, people clinging to that title, or how does that statistically break?
Right.
How does that happen?
So Ryan Burge has talked about this. So Ryan Burge is a great follow on Twitter. He's political scientist, and he posts all kinds of interesting religion and politics data. And he is remarkably, like Ryan Burge, I think, has done a great job of staying nonpartisan. Like he doesn't come out one way or the other. He's just posting interesting data, and I think that allows him to kind of speak to a lot of different audiences. He's also a pastor, Ryan Burge is, who leads a church in Illinois. So one of the things that he has shown over the past few years is that you have a growing, because of sorting, you have a growing number of Christians who are Republicans, or Republicans who identify as Christian, but they don't go to church. Like they are not personally connected to religion. They're not attending churches. They're not participating, but they have kept that label, right? Because for them it means all the things that implies. It means conservative. It means Republican. It means religious Republican. That's what Ryan Burge would say is like the title evangelical now. Basically just means religious Republican. Pew Research Center, within the last few years, they did a fascinating study. They wanted to see, because of all of the controversy about this title, white evangelicalism and its connection to Trump, they surveyed people. They wanted to see what percentage of white Americans would identify as evangelical and how that had changed over time from 2015 to 2020. And they assumed, like I would have as well, I would have guessed that people would have been running from that label. Like people would have abandoned that. But they actually found out the percentage of white Americans who identified as an evangelical had increased during that time. But when they dug into the data a little bit further, they found that it wasn't people who had started to go to church, or it wasn't people who had changed. It was just Trump supporters. It was almost completely driven by just people who had supported Donald Trump. So in that time, even in that 5 years, what white Americans had discovered was that evangelical is the label for you, Not if you're religious, but if you are just a pro-Christian Trump supporter. And so I think that is increasingly the case. I think that, and this is the danger. This is actually the reverse danger. So you have one danger that, like, young people who say that this doesn't fit my understanding of what faith should be, and so I'm out of here, right? Like, I don't want any part of this. But you also have this other part of people who stay, not because they believe anything that is Christian, that is they find a personal connection to it, other than the identity that attaches them to a political movement that says, I am a Christian because I'm not an atheist, because I'm not a leftist, because I'm not a woke socialist, because I'm not a Democrat. That's who we are. And so I think that is increasingly becoming the case. And the danger, obviously, is that even the language of Christian gets emptied out of any kind of understanding. And it becomes, I think, what I've called like the Europeanization of Christian nationalism. Europe has Christian nationalism too, but they don't have the kind of evangelical like culture that we have, where people are going to church and like people are reading their Bibles and people are connected to faith in some way. People have abandoned, like nobody goes to church. For their Christian nation just means I'm not Muslim. It means I was born here. It means this is a nation for us and not you. And that is what we're moving to in the United States, is like, churches are empty, but people are calling themselves Christians because it means I'm not a leftist, atheist, woke, socialist, Muslim. And so no theology attached to that, no practice attached to that, but just labels. Does that make sense? Okay.
I don't have anything to say. Here's what I was thinking of. There has never been a stronger correlation between church and culture than Hitler's Germany. They called themselves the Deutsche Christen. And in doing so, they were wiping out, they wanted to prove that Jesus was not a Jew. He was a Galilean. Walter Grundmann was the scholar who wrote this book. Kittle's Dictionary, which everybody uses in seminary, was inspired, volumes 3 and 4, by the Third Reich publications. Ooh. Gerhard Kittel was a strong Nazi. The third volume was dedicated to those who, like John the Baptist, had preached the gospel and given their lives for Hitler. So that culture, that connection of culture and church has potential implications. I'm not saying we're on the road to Hitler, though some people like to drive to the final conclusion. I think we need to be really vigilant about seeing where this can go if we're not careful. And I think there are some people in the United States who would go there.
Yep. That's true. I think an important book on that topic, Robert Paxton's Anatomy of Fascism, is a great book. The reason why it's an important book, and the reason I recommend it to you now, is it was written in 2005, so this is pre-Trump. Like, this is so, and why I say that is because, like, there can be an argument made that, like, every fascism book written since 2016 is really just kind of like reading Trump back into fascism and kind of like saying, hey, we're on the road, you know? Robert Paxton is writing in 2005. He's like way before any of that is on the horizon. And he's arguing this is what happens. This is what happened in Germany and Italy and places where fascism almost hit. And one of the things he argues is fascism happens in stages. There's like 5 levels of this. And at the level 1 level, it's just kind of like this underlying idea that the nation is for people like us, not them, that outsiders are contaminants that we need to drive out, that they celebrate violence, they even kind of glory in it, they think violence is a great thing to get the job done, they want to kind of militarize everything, and they want to arm the populace and have this kind of fraternity of armed people that they like. A lot of things that when you listen to it, it's a great audiobook, a lot of the things that when you follow it will sound eerily familiar in 2005 when he's writing it. And so I think it is a great book to say that just because like every liberal democracy has elements at this level 1 of fascism, right? Like just the ideology that is kind of friendly to it. And it doesn't mean that we'll get there. Most never get there. But we don't get there because we have democratic norms, because we have elections, because we make decisions to say we will not go down that road. And I think it's important that we continue to have those conversations without saying we're in this kind of like fascist moment. We can always say, how do we make sure that we protect ourselves through strong democratic norms and institutions to preserve ourselves from ever going down that road, if that makes sense.
In the back?
Yeah, so y'all brought up the recent phenomenon of people, or not recent, I guess, anyway, the phenomenon of people trying to conform Jesus to themselves rather than to conform themselves to Jesus. How would you recommend that you keep yourself from becoming like an internal echo chamber and just trying to align yourself with whatever politics you follow rather than align yourself with the Bible?
I teach New Testament, so I like to think that I have an answer to this question, but there is an echo chamber that does take place in New Testament studies. So I would say that we need to read carefully the Gospels, to watch Jesus behave carefully, to listen to his words, and to assume that we are not consistent with what he said as much as we should be, and listen to him tell us where we need to improve or we need work. I don't know of anything else. I mean, you might have, if you're tough enough, you can get with some people who can say to you, you're not doing very well on the economic front. But it'd have to be some people you trust. But I think by and large, I think personally, we can listen to this, and I think also we can look at our behaviors. We can look at our behaviors and see if our behaviors are consistent with the behaviors of Jesus, who seemed to find the lepers and the marginalized in his society when other people didn't see them. And are we finding those same people in our culture? Because ultimately, I don't know if you read Charles Marsh. You know Charles Marsh at Virginia?
On Twitter? Like the
No, I don't know if he tweets.
I don't know.
No,
the name
of
sounds
his
familiar in
books,
Virginia.
Charles.
Oh, no, then I don't know.
Okay,
Yeah,
he talks about lived theology as the ultimate form of theology, rather than what we believe, but what kind of theology do we perceive by our behaviors? And that is the ultimate form of theology. And I think that that will reveal to us areas for improvement.
Charles Marsh, that's the
Charles
author?
Marsh?
Yeah, I like
He's,
that. I like that quote.
He's written on the beloved community,
Okay.
and he just recently wrote quite a biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Okay.
It's quite the biography.
Yeah, I'll follow up on that.
His title? I told you I don't remember titles anymore.
Charles Marsh.
Something with a glory in it, the word Charles Marsh. Pretty easy to Google. Just look it up on Twitter or whatever it's called, Amazon.
Yeah. Whatever it's called.
My question kind of goes on the close, but like we're going into an election year, I guess, next year. And so I was just wondering what your guys' perspective is on like how as Christians we can prepare ourselves to do that better than we did last time, especially concerning like the Christian nationalism that we're going to confront probably even more than we did last time.
Oh, golly. Shoot. Yeah, it's gonna be a mess. It's I mean, like it's gonna be like it's already a mess, right? Like it's gonna be a mess. Like we don't know how it's gonna go with the primaries, the Republican primary. So like so much of it is in flux now. Like I think it's just honestly talking about like the political situation now with Biden being very old and not super like even enthusiastic about his own kind of like future there. And Trump's legal trouble and DeSantis kind of maneuvering, but DeSantis not being popular now. Like Trump is still, despite all the legal trouble, still the majority of Republicans will go for him. That is amazing and unprecedented. So like I wish I wish we could just say, well, this is just like Reagan in '84. You know, like that's not true. I don't know what politician is going to be like, well, this is just like that other time, like this happened, and here's how that went down, and what precedent do we have for this kind of thing? So the best we can do, honestly, like as Christians, is really to think. I mean, these are the moments where you don't want to think about fear and anxiety. You want to think about principles. Okay, so that is, I guess, I wish we would have started this way. Back in every election, I think I would like to think it would come back to this, is because I can tell you a great book, and it's not a great book because it's encouraging. It's a great book because it's just really honest. It's actually a really discouraging book, but it's called Democracy for Realists by Aiken and Bartels, and you could just probably read the intro and the conclusion on, because a lot of it is just kind of them demonstrating the thesis. But what they argue is that like from political scientist standpoint, like the way voting habits work and patterns, like we just kind of know that like most Americans don't make voting decisions in light of their kind of like really deep dive into policy and their understanding of like how these kinds of decisions make and how what the politicians will do and how they understand all the issues and the politicians themselves. Most Americans are making voting decisions with party, whatever party they kind of feel they belong to. So most people who voted for Trump in 2016 or Hillary in 2016 voted because they're Democrats or Republicans. That's it, right? Not because they're fascists or liberals or whatever. They voted for party. After that, though, we vote on the dumbest things, right? Like we vote on anxiety and fear. So we vote on emotions. And we vote on other things like whether or not there was a natural disaster 2 weeks before the election, or gas prices went up, or whatever thing I can blame on some politician for not being what I want them to be. In those situations, understanding that like people are just inclined to do things on the basis of like emotion and fear, like I think requires us, and to know that politicians know that and will try to manipulate our anxiety and fears, that is their goal. Like that is what politicians will try to do and say, this is the most important election ever, and everything's riding on this, and everything's going to hell if we don't do something and you vote how I want you to. It's the times like that where Christians actually have to think about like, what are the principles that we stand on? Who am I? Who is Christ? What am I here for? Why are Christians here? And what kind of people that we want to represent and be here on earth? So that we're not so kind of tossed back and forth by like fear and anxiety about the way things are going to go. And so I hope we have more, as crazy as it's going to be, and it's going to be nuts, right? Like it really will be. As crazy as it's going to be, I think that's when we need to have these conversations to say like, what is our theopolitical hermeneutic? What are the principles that we stand on? Why are we here? And what do we want the world to know about Christians and our role in 2024, rather than what the world knows about Christians' role in 2016 and 2020, right? So that we can be a witness, so that we can be the salt and the light, and not another example of just a bunch of like really scared, angry people who are manipulated yet again by some demagogue. Does that make sense? Does that help? Okay. Yeah.
Sam's much more alert to these things than I am. But I would say, I'll just tell you the truth about myself about this, okay? Number one, I will do everything I can to avoid political conversations in social media.
Yeah.
I will not.
I don't do that, but like I was saying like that is good practice. I don't say yeah as in like, yeah, I'm going to do that. Like I'm not going to do that, but like I think that is wise practice. Yes.
I will avoid that. I will never take a position on a presidential candidate in public. The third thing is, I despise Christian engagement in culture war, because I think it's a never-ending jihad, to use the Arabic word. It's a struggle of back and forth. You're going to win some and you're going to lose some. I'm old enough to remember that sometimes Republicans win and sometimes Democrats win, and it just goes back and forth. And this isn't very popular, but until I see the culture war die among evangelicals, I will not vote for a president of any sort. I don't vote.
Wow.
So That shows you my political Anabaptism. I mean, I don't mind voting locally because it's not a culture war, but I don't want to be identified with this war of trying to win, because I don't believe that's the victory that I want to fight for. I don't believe, I have a post every year after the election. It's either November 6th or 7th. It's one of those days in there that says, no matter what happens, this morning I wake up and Jesus is still the Lord, no matter who is the president. And that I try, it helps me, but I know my students, when Donald Trump was elected, it was devastating for so many of my students because of their sensitivity about the political issues. And I tried to counsel them and help them, but, you know, that's my position on it. But I do think, I won't go where Sam went, but I totally agree with him that we need to work on the principles that we're involved in rather than superficial categories that we use to make decisions. I mean, some of it's good looks. You know, if they're good looking, we vote for them.
That's true.
Tall and thin.
That's true. And I want to reemphasize something
Trump got
Scott
it,
said
I
a second
don't
ago about I wish more Christians got involved in local politics. And I don't mean like brought culture war into local politics. I just mean like ran for council or we're even knowledgeable or like what's going on. Like we have one of the worst things that's happened within the last few decades is we have nationalized our politics in such a way as to where like the person running for school board has to have some position on Pelosi. Right, like, and they advertise it, right? Like, what does that even matter? Like, you're in school board, like, none of that even, like, or the people who are the state superintendent of education or those kinds of things have to have some kind of, like, national party position that they identify themselves with so that people know, are you a good guy or a bad guy? Are you on my team or not? I think that is one of the most damaging and unfortunate, because you end up with just kind of, like, it just ends up kind of, like, straight ticket voting, and I wish we would defuse that by people being more knowledgeable and aware of kind of local politics so that everything didn't become, the presidential politics is such a Patriots versus Packers kind of like sports, tribal psychology kind of thing where it doesn't need to be at the local level. And so I love that idea of just getting more aware of local politics and getting involved there. Kenneth.
I guess like you mentioned, like you don't want to get caught up in a culture war, but it's like it kind of keeps up with this nonsense. I see a lot of like, we love our neighbor, like a lot of right-wing Christians saying, we love our neighbor through cultural war.
Yes.
Yeah. So like, how would you, I guess, respond to that?
I mean, I think that's kind of, yeah, I mean, what I was mentioning, I think that's kind of the rhetorical move. It's because they know they can't say, I hate my neighbor, right? Like, I hate these people who are different from me. I want to control them and do bad things to them. You can't say that, as a Christian at least. I mean, some of them probably do, but like, you can't say that and maintain this kind of like facade of like, hey, this is all in Jesus' name. And so you just have to kind of, I think, dialogue with that. Like, what does it really mean to love your neighbor? Like, would you prefer they do that to you? Will you, how about this? When in 15 years, when Christians are the minority in this country, will you prefer that they do that to you? When they, when they have the democratic opportunity to lock you up and persecute you, really, and not just fake persecute you, but I mean like really persecute you. How would you like to be treated by them? I think that's a question Christians probably should legitimately ask themselves and wonder, like, how do we institute the kind of democratic, pro-democratic, liberal democratic norms to where we can all have religious freedom and we can all kind of exercise our rights in the way that I think is God-honoring and good. Yeah.
In your research and data collecting, what do you think has been one of the most harmful or extreme ways people have reverse engineered their faith around their politics?
I think justification of violence is probably the worst. I think Second Amendment worship in this is is amazing to me. Like, and so we did a survey a couple of years ago where we just gave Americans the Bill of Rights. We basically said, what's the most important right? Like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, Second Amendment, unlawful searches and seizures, all of those kinds of things. And it was fascinating to me that the more Christian nationalist you were, it wasn't religious freedom, it was Second Amendment. Like you thought that was the greatest, the most important right was the Second Amendment right. And that makes you more like Matt Walsh than it makes you like Jesus. It makes you somebody like, and I mean literally he says that, like the Second Amendment's more important than voting rights, it's more important than anything like that because it's the one that ensures all the others, right? Like so the argument that Christians ought to be pro-violence, to me I think is one of the greatest examples of how we have subordinated our own values and beliefs to kind of partisan and culture war ideals. A great book that I just finished on Audible the other day, and I just want to make sure I got the title right. It's a short one. Sorry, not to throw shade at Scott for not getting titles right. But it's The Second Amendment, a biography by Michael Waldman. It's a short one. It's about a 7-hour. It's a 7-hour read. It's not bad.
Princeton University.
Oh, okay, gosh.
Is that biography series from Princeton?
Well, I don't know. That's just on the Second Amendment, but but I mean he really traces the idea that like this idea that like every American citizen, that it wasn't connected to like the militia and like being able to like arm a militia and all those kinds of things. This idea that the Second Amendment is about every citizen being able to have basically unlimited kind of access to firearms for personal safety and stand your ground laws, like that is a recent phenomenon. That is an invention. That is partly like the maneuvering of the NRA and Republicans together, who have been successfully able to bring about this idea that is a Christian thing. The most Christian thing you can do is to defend gun rights, and I mean like AK-47s and AR-15s and semi-automatics and all those kinds of things, and that is the hill that we will die on. That one is the one that comes to mind. That being a Christian means I'm actually now on the side of people who justify my right to be able to exercise lethal violence if I feel in any way threatened at all, and then to justify that legally is probably the one that comes to mind. But maybe others have.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I want everyone to give Sam Perry.
Thank you. Good lad.
I've read him and I've read about him, and tonight my respect for you has gone up, and I just want to say thanks.
so glad
so
that
much.
I didn't go down. That'd have been unfortunate.
No, I mean your work is wonderful, and you did a great job with everyone here. So thank you very much.